In NBC's Studio 6B at Rockefeller Center, a smiling talk show host was about to turn faith into a punchline. What began as another night of celebrity laughter and rehearsed charm turned deadly serious when an unshakable guest refused to play along. Chuck Norris wasn't your typical late-night guest. For decades, he'd been a world champion martial artist and Hollywood icon, known for turning calm into combat and silence into dominance. When Jimmy Fallon tried to mock his faith on live television, he had no idea he was stepping into a different kind of arena, one where conviction outweighed applause. Norris's quiet response would trigger a storm that silenced millions and redefined what authenticity meant under the studio lights. What began as a comedy segment would become a reckoning. The Tonight Show would never be the same after one man chose truth over entertainment, and the world leaned in to listen. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The studio pulsed with energy, a glittering hive of activity as stagehands adjusted lights, makeup artists darted between guests, and producers barked instructions through headsets. Behind the glossy veneer of NBC's Studio 6B in Rockefeller Center, The Tonight Show was a precision machine. Each component finely tuned for maximum entertainment value. Tonight's episode promised something special. Martial arts legend Chuck Norris was making his first late-night appearance in nearly 5 years. Jimmy Fallon paced in his dressing room, scanning notes while a stylist adjusted his tie. At 48, Fallon had mastered the science of approachable celebrity, the self-deprecating charm, the infectious laugh, the ability to make guests feel simultaneously special and unguarded. His producer, Gavin, knocked twice before entering. Chuck's arrived. He's in makeup now. Jimmy nodded, eyes still on his notes. What's his mood like? Calm, pleasant. Not much small talk, got it. The roundhouse kick bit's still good to go. Gavin hesitated. Yeah, we've got the dummy set up, but his team mentioned he might prefer to focus on the new charity work. Jimmy waved dismissively. Everyone's seen his charity work. They tune in for the Chuck Norris. They remember Walker. Texas Ranger, not Walker. Texas preacher. He chuckled at his own joke. We'll touch on the charity stuff, but let's keep it light, keep it moving. Gavin nodded and retreated, leaving Jimmy to adjust his smile in the mirror. In 15 minutes, he'd transform into the night's conductor, channeling the audience's energy like a current. The band's opening riff vibrated through the studio as Jimmy burst onto the stage, the audience rising in a wave of applause. He moved with practiced energy, pointing, grinning, soaking in the adoration like oxygen. His monologue hit all the right notes. A jab at the day's politics, a self-deprecating joke about his own dancing, a gentle ribbing of celebrity culture. The crowd was his completely. We've got an amazing show tonight, folks. Jimmy's voice carried the perfect blend of enthusiasm and intimacy. Academy Award winner Regina King is here. Applause. Musical performance by Grammy nominees. The Loomers. Louder applause. And you know him as a martial arts legend, action star, and internet meme sensation. Please welcome Chuck Norris. The audience erupted, many rising to their feet in anticipation. The camera panned to the side entrance where Chuck Norris emerged, walking with understated confidence. At 82, Chuck moved with the fluid ease of someone half his age, not the bombastic energy of a Hollywood action hero, but the centered calm of a man who had nothing left to prove. His silver hair and beard were neatly trimmed, his blue eyes clear and alert. He wore a simple black shirt under a blazer. No flashy accessories, no attention-grabbing fashion statements. He raised a hand in greeting, nodding appreciatively at the crowd's welcome. Jimmy bounded over, arms wide in theatrical welcome. Chuck Norris, ladies and gentlemen, the man, the myth, the legend. They shook hands. Chuck's grip firm but not showy. Man, it is an honor to have you here. Absolute honor. Thank you, Jimmy. Good to be here. Chuck's voice was measured, a low rumble that somehow cut through the applause without effort. They settled into their seats. Jimmy perched forward eagerly. Chuck relaxed but attentive. The initial exchange followed the familiar talk show rhythm, reminiscing about Chuck's early days, his transition from martial arts to Hollywood, the cultural phenomenon of Chuck Norris facts. So I've got to ask. Jimmy leaned in. Voice conspiratorial. What's your favorite Chuck Norris fact? You know, Chuck Norris doesn't do push-ups. He pushes the earth down. That kind of thing. A small smile played at the corners of Chuck's mouth. I've always liked that they say I can slam a revolving door. The audience laughed appreciatively. Jimmy's eyes lit up with the knowledge that they were hitting the right notes. This was what people wanted, the Chuck Norris of internet lore, not whatever reinvention he might have undergone in recent years. You've lived quite a life, Jimmy continued. Black belt in 6 different martial arts disciplines, 30 films, a hit TV show. Not many people can claim a resume like that. Chuck nodded, humble yet aware of his achievements. I've been blessed with opportunities. And speaking of blessings, Jimmy segued smoothly. You've been involved with some charity work recently, haven't you? Something about martial arts programs for at-risk youth. For the first time, genuine animation crossed Chuck's face. Yes, the Kickstart Kids Foundation. We've been operating for over 20 years now, teaching martial arts values, discipline, respect, integrity to middle school students. Over 110,000 kids have gone through the program. That's amazing, Jimmy said, though his eyes darted briefly to his notes, eager to move past the charitable segment. Now I have to ask about your new book. It's a bit of a departure from your action persona. It is, Chuck acknowledged, shifting slightly in his chair. It's called Words of a Champion, Daily Inspiration for the Journey of Faith. It's a devotional daily reading centered around what Jesus has taught me through my life's journey. A momentary silence fell, not the comfortable, expectant silence of good television, but the slightly awkward pause of unexpected sincerity. Jimmy recovered quickly, though his smile flickered. Jesus, huh? So he's like your co-author. He raised an eyebrow at the audience, inviting them into the joke. A few chuckles rippled through the crowd, uncertain, testing the waters. Chuck didn't immediately respond. His expression unchanged, save for a subtle shift in his eyes. The cameraman, Mark Chen, instinctively tightened his frame on Chuck's face, sensing a moment. In a way, Chuck finally answered, his tone gentle but firm. My relationship with Jesus Christ is the foundation of everything meaningful in my life. Jimmy's laugh came a beat too quickly. Well, I always thought roundhouse kicks were your foundation, but sure, Jesus works too. He mimed a kick, nearly tipping out of his chair for comedic effect. This time, the audience's laughter was louder, the tension broken by physical comedy. But not everyone laughed. In the front row, an older woman exchanged glances with her husband. On the sidelines, a producer made a cutting motion with his hand, signaling to move on quickly. Chuck's expression hadn't changed. No anger, no embarrassment, just that same steady gaze. His hands remained relaxed on the chair arms, his posture open. But something had shifted in the atmosphere of the studio. A subtle change in pressure, like the moment before a storm. Jimmy felt it too. He'd conducted thousands of interviews, developed an instinct for energy shifts in a room. This one made him uneasy. Chuck Norris wasn't playing the game, wasn't parrying the joke, wasn't voling back with humor, wasn't diffusing with self-deprecation. He simply sat present and unperturbed like a mountain regarding a breeze. So, Jimmy shuffled his cards. Tell us about your workout routine. At 82, you're still in incredible shape. What's the secret? But the momentum had faltered. The easy rhythm of the interview had developed a skip, a hesitation. The audience sensed it too. Their attention sharpened, phones lowering as they leaned forward slightly. What was supposed to be a lighthearted segment celebrating pop culture nostalgia had veered into unfamiliar territory. The producers in the control room exchanged nervous glances. The camera operators adjusted their focus, instinctively drawn to the subtle tension building on stage. Jimmy Fallon was a master of keeping things upbeat, of riding whatever energy emerged and channeling it into entertainment. But as he looked into Chuck Norris's unwavering blue eyes, he realized he was facing something his usual tools couldn't quite manage. The legend sitting across from him wasn't angry. He wasn't offended. He was simply present, and somehow that presence weighed more than any reaction could have. We'll be right back with more Chuck Norris. After this break, Jimmy announced, his trademark grin firmly back in place as the camera pulled back. But as the applause sign lit up and the audience responded on cue, Chuck's gaze remained steady, carrying a quiet message that needed no words. Some things weren't meant to be punchlines. The commercial break hummed with activity. Makeup artists darted forward to touch up both men's faces. Production assistants skewered across the stage, adjusting minute details. Jimmy's smile vanished the moment the cameras stopped rolling. He leaned toward his producer, Gavin, who had appeared at the edge of the stage. "What's with the Jesus stuff?" Jimmy whispered, his voice tight. "I thought we were doing the action hero bit. The roundhouse kick demonstration is next." "Sorry, we didn't know he'd go there," Gavin muttered. "Just pivot back to the film career after the break." Jimmy nodded tersely as Gavin retreated. He turned back to Chuck with his professional smile reinstated, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. Having fun so far? We're going to do the kick demonstration when we come back from break. Chuck nodded pleasantly. Sure, Jimmy. Whatever you'd like. His calm was almost unsettling. No hint of offense, no trace of discomfort, just that same centered presence. A production assistant counted down. Back in 5-4. The audience applauded on cue as the cameras rolled again. Jimmy leaned forward, performance energy restored. We're back with martial arts legend Chuck Norris. Now, Chuck, we've set up something special. Actually, Jimmy, Chuck interrupted, his voice gentle but firm. Before we move on, I'd like to address what we were discussing. The unexpected interruption created a tiny ripple of surprise. Jimmy Fallon wasn't often derailed from his planned segments. He recovered quickly, though a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. Of course. Yeah, your faith. He pronounced the word carefully, like handling an unfamiliar object. My faith isn't just a hobby or an interesting fact about me, Chuck said, his tone conversational, yet somehow commanding complete attention. When I mentioned Jesus as the foundation of my life, that wasn't a setup for a punchline. A heavy silence settled over the studio. In the control room, producers frantically conferred, wondering if they should cut to another commercial. In the audience, phones raised higher, sensing something unscripted and authentic happening. Jimmy shifted uncomfortably. Hey, no offense intended. We keep things light here, you know. All in good fun. I'm not offended, Chuck replied with surprising warmth. But I think there's a difference between humor and dismissal. The audience was completely still now. No rustling candy wrappers, no whispered conversations. Even the band members watched with undivided attention. Mark Chen, the veteran cameraman who'd filmed hundreds of celebrities, found himself holding his breath as he kept his shot steady on Chuck's face. You know, Jimmy, Chuck continued, before I found faith, my identity was completely wrapped up in my toughness, in what I could accomplish, in how many people recognized me on the street. I thought strength was about dominance and control. The camera caught Jimmy's expression, a mixture of fascination and alarm. This wasn't the broadcast-friendly banter his show thrived on. This was becoming something else entirely, something authentic and unfiltered. The teleprompter offered no guidance. The pre-written questions suddenly seemed irrelevant. I spent decades building a career on playing tough guys who solved problems with their fists, Chuck said. But the strongest man I ever knew was a pastor who faced terminal cancer with unwavering peace, because he trusted Jesus completely. His voice remained steady, neither preachy nor defensive. That's the kind of strength I aspire to now. The mention of the pastor triggered a memory for Chuck, one he didn't share aloud, but that passed through his mind with perfect clarity. Pastor John lying in his hospital bed, oxygen tubes in his nose, smiling serenely as he told Chuck, "You don't defend faith with noise. You reveal it with stillness." That memory had guided him through countless interviews, public appearances, and now this unexpected moment. In the front row, the older woman, who had noticed the earlier tension, nudged her husband again. "He's not backing down," she whispered. Her husband nodded, a look of respect crossing his face. 3 rows back, a young man who'd come for the celebrity sightings found himself strangely moved by the sincerity in Chuck's voice. Jimmy attempted to regain control of the segment. Well, we all find inspiration in different places, right? Some people have religion, some have family, some have, I don't know, CrossFit. He looked toward the audience for the expected laughter. It came, but it was muted, uncertain. The joke felt hollow in the wake of Chuck's sincerity. Of course, Chuck agreed, but I think we do ourselves a disservice when we treat profound beliefs as punchlines. Jimmy's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. The challenge of the moment was clear. Either acknowledge the unexpected depth of the conversation, or forcibly steer it back to safer waters. Behind the cameras, Gavin was making frantic, wrap-it-up gestures, drawing a finger across his throat. "Well, this got deep fast," Jimmy said with a nervous chuckle. "Let's lighten the mood with that roundhouse kick demonstration we promised. We've got a special dummy set up and you can laugh, Jimmy." Chuck's voice was quiet but carried throughout the studio. "But I'm not ashamed of what gives me strength." The simplicity of the statement, delivered without anger or accusation, landed with unexpected impact. Jimmy's practice persona faltered. For a brief moment, the audience glimpsed something rarely seen on late-night television: genuine introspection, crossing the face of their typically carefree host. Offstage, the production team erupted into silent chaos. The director's voice hissed through headsets. "Cut to commercial, cut now." But before they could fade out, Jimmy made a split-second decision. Instead of deflecting again, he leaned forward, his expression shifting to something more authentic than his usual performative interest. "Why Jesus, though?" he asked, the question emerging with surprising sincerity. "I mean, you've accomplished so much on your own. You're Chuck Norris." For God's sake, the accidental invocation hung in the air. A few nervous titters sounded from the audience, quickly fading to silence. "That's exactly it, Jimmy," Chuck replied, a small smile forming. "Everything I've accomplished on my own left me empty until I realized I was never meant to do it alone." In the control room, fingers hovered over buttons, ready to cut the segment. But something held them back. Perhaps professional curiosity, perhaps the rare authenticity of the moment unfolding. The floor director had stopped making signals. Even Gavin stood transfixed at the edge of the stage, sensing that something important was happening, something beyond ratings and viral moments. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Mark Chen adjusted his camera angle slightly, capturing both men in profile, of the seasoned martial artist and the youthful host, separated by a small table but seemingly worlds apart in their approach to the conversation. In that frame, he somehow captured the essence of the moment, entertainment culture colliding with uncalculated conviction. The tension in the studio wasn't hostile. It was the tension of unexpected depth, of a script abandoned, of reality intruding into the carefully constructed world of late-night comedy. And as the seconds ticked by, the audience leaned forward, collectively holding their breath. No one knew where this was going, but everyone from the newest production assistant to the most jaded audience member sensed they were witnessing something rare on television. Unvarnished truth. "We're going to break format a bit here," Jimmy said, his voice carrying a note of surrender that the regular viewers of his show would have found unfamiliar. He turned to the audience with hands spread. "I mean, it's not every day Chuck Norris shows up and flips the script, right?" The audience responded with appreciative laughter. But it wasn't the usual raucous reaction to Jimmy's jokes. There was something thoughtful in it, almost respectful. A recognition that they were witnessing something beyond the usual celebrity banter. Jimmy turned back to Chuck, dropping the performance energy several notches. "So what's Jesus got to do with roundhouse kicks? I'm genuinely curious now." It was meant to be lighthearted, a bridge between comedy and sincerity, but the attempt at humor fell flat. The question hung in the air, revealing more about Jimmy's discomfort than eliciting the response he'd hoped for. Chuck didn't immediately answer. He took a breath, seeming to consider whether the question deserved a serious response or was yet another setup for a punchline. The hesitation wasn't born of uncertainty but of deliberation. A martial artist choosing his position carefully. "Discipline," Chuck finally said. "Both my faith and martial arts have taught me that true strength comes from discipline, from doing what's right, even when it's difficult." He shifted slightly in his chair, his posture relaxed but dignified. "The techniques I learned in karate, they're not about dominating others. They're about mastering yourself." The band members exchanged glances. Questlove, the band leader, nodded almost imperceptibly, recognizing the genuine moment unfolding before them. Behind his drum set, he'd witnessed thousands of celebrity interviews, some authentic, many performative. This one was undeniably real. "I spent decades throwing punches and kicks on screen," Chuck continued. "But the hardest battles I've fought were internal pride, anger, the need to prove myself. That's where my faith has been my greatest strength." In his mind, Chuck was back in a small gym in Dallas 15 years earlier. Pastor John had visited him during a particularly grueling training session for a charity exhibition. The older man had watched him execute a series of flawless kicks, then said something Chuck never forgot. "All this power, and yet the most powerful thing about you is your capacity for surrender." The memory was vivid. The gym's fluorescent lights, the sharp scent of athletic tape and sweat. Pastor John's thin frame, perched on a folding chair, Bible resting on his knees. That day, Chuck had been frustrated, pushing his aging body through routines designed for younger men. His kicks were still precise, his form still excellent. But time was an opponent he couldn't defeat. "You're fighting it?" Pastor John had observed quietly. "Fighting what?" Chuck had asked, wiping sweat from his brow. "Time change, the natural order of things." The pastor had smiled gently. You've spent your life mastering control, Chuck. But the greatest spiritual strength comes from knowing when to surrender control. That paradox had puzzled Chuck then. Now, sitting under the bright studio lights with millions potentially watching, he grasped it completely. Sometimes the greatest strength was shown not in fighting back but in standing firm with quiet dignity. Jimmy was silent, his usual rapid-fire banter temporarily extinguished. The silence stretched long enough to be noticeable in television terms: 3, 4, 5 seconds without speech. An eternity in broadcast. In the control room, the producer whispered urgently through the director's headset, "Keep it moving. This is dead air." But the director, sensing something significant unfolding, replied simply, "Wait, we have a saying in martial arts." Chuck said, filling the space with quiet authority, "The true warrior is the one who can choose peace when peace is hardest." I found that Jesus taught the same thing thousands of years before any martial art was formalized. In the front row, the older woman dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. 3 rows back, a young man who had come to the show wearing a vintage Walker Texas Ranger t-shirt sat with his phone forgotten in his hand, completely absorbed. Even the usually restless studio audience had settled into a collective stillness. Not the manufactured hush of television timing, but the genuine quiet of people listening with their full attention. Mark Chen, the cameraman, felt something shift in his approach to filming the segment. Usually, he sought reaction shots, dramatic moments, the exchange of energy between host and guest. Now he found himself holding steady on Chuck's face, instinctively understanding that the power of this moment lay in its stillness, not its movement. Through his viewfinder, Mark saw something rarely captured on late-night television: authenticity, unmarred by performance anxiety, conviction untainted by the need for approval. In 15 years behind the camera, he developed a sixth sense for genuine moments. This wasn't just real, it was transformative. Jimmy cleared his throat, visibly processing how to respond. His eyes darted to Gavin at the edge of the stage, seeking direction, but his producer seemed equally transfixed by the unexpected turn of events. "I've never thought about it that way," Jimmy admitted, dropping the veneer of the entertainer for a moment. "Most religious people I meet I don't know more about telling others what they should believe. That's not faith," Chuck replied gently. "That's insecurity dressed up as conviction." The simple statement resonated through the studio like a bell tone. In the control room, the director whispered, "Stay wide on both of them. Don't cut away." Chuck leaned forward slightly, his presence filling the space between them without any hint of aggression. "When I started in martial arts as a young man, I thought strength was about dominating opponents, being faster, stronger, more skilled. It took years to understand that true mastery isn't about what you can do to others, but what you can master in yourself." The parallel to faith wasn't explicitly stated, but it hung in the air, understood by many listening. Chuck continued, his voice carrying the weight of lived experience rather than rehearsed talking points. "When I was younger," he said, "I thought being strong meant never showing weakness. Jesus taught me that acknowledging weakness is the beginning of true strength." The studio felt different now, not like a stage for entertainment, but like a space where something authentic was being shared. The overhead lights, designed to eliminate shadows and create the illusion of perpetual daytime, somehow seemed less harsh. The ever-present logo mugs on the desk between them, product placement carefully angled toward cameras, suddenly seemed like trivial intrusions in a meaningful exchange. Jimmy leaned back slightly, his trademark rapid energy notably subdued. "You know," he said with surprising candor, "we had this whole segment planned. You were going to demonstrate a roundhouse kick on a dummy. We'd all laugh. It would probably go viral. We can still do that," Chuck offered with a genuine smile. "I'm not opposed to having fun." "No," but Jimmy hesitated, searching for words. "It feels like we'd be going backward, like putting on a mask after we've already seen each other's faces." The metaphor emerged unplanned, surprising even Jimmy himself. A murmur ran through the audience. Not the anticipatory buzz of an upcoming comedy bit, but the appreciative recognition of an unexpected truth. In the third row, a middle-aged woman whispered to her husband, "I've never seen Jimmy like this before." Her husband nodded, equally surprised by the host's uncharacteristic sincerity. Chuck's expression softened with appreciation. "That's well said, Jimmy. Very well said." The acknowledgement from a man known for physical prowess rather than verbal dexterity carried a warmth that further transformed the atmosphere. This wasn't the prescribed exchange of a talk show. It was two human beings connecting beyond their public personas. In that moment, Jimmy seemed to make a decision. He set aside the blue card containing his prepared questions and leaned forward, elbows on his desk. "Can I ask you something that's not on my cards?" He said, the question itself an admission that they had ventured beyond the script. Chuck nodded. "Of course, you've had this remarkable career, world champion, movie star, television icon. You could rest on those accomplishments. Why is faith so important to you now? Why not just enjoy the legacy?" It was a genuine question, not a setup for a joke or a transition to another topic. Jimmy's expression held real curiosity, perhaps even a hint of personal searching beneath the professional inquiry. Chuck considered the question, his weathered face thoughtful beneath the studio lights. When he answered, his voice carried no hint of rehearsal. "Because accomplishments fade, Jimmy. Trophies gather dust. Even fame eventually dims." He gestured toward the audience. "Most of the younger folks here probably know me more as an internet meme than for any of my actual work." A gentle ripple of laughter acknowledged the truth of this observation, but real meaning that doesn't fade. Understanding your purpose, knowing that you're loved, not for what you've accomplished, but simply for who you are. Chuck paused, his eyes reflecting decades of experience. That's what carries you through when everything else falls away. In the control room, the commercial break timer flashed warning signals. The director's voice came through headsets. "We need to break in 30 seconds. Jimmy nodded almost imperceptibly at the signal, then turned back to Chuck. "We have to go to commercial, but when we come back, I want to hear more about this. Not the rehearsed stuff, but the real thing." He turned to the audience with a different kind of smile than his usual theatrical grin. "We'll be right back with more Chuck Norris, the man behind the legends." As the applause sign lit up and the cameras began to pull back, Chuck nodded appreciatively. The audience's applause felt different too. Not the automatic response to a cue, but something more thoughtful, more engaged in the front row. Elaine Winters turned to her husband, her voice barely audible above the applause. "This is why we came tonight, not for the jokes, but for this." Robert nodded, squeezing her hand. As a retired pastor himself, he recognized the rare opportunity unfolding faith being discussed, not as a political position or a punchline, but as a lived experience with real consequences. Mark Chen kept his camera on the two men as the director counted down to commercial. In the final seconds before cutting away, he captured something subtle but significant, a moment of genuine connection. As Jimmy leaned toward Chuck and said something the microphones didn't catch, something that made the martial arts legend nod with quiet understanding. The red light on the camera blinked off. The applause sign darkened. The studio lights dimmed slightly for the commercial break. But the energy in Studio 6B remained charged with expectation, the sense that they were witnessing not just another celebrity interview, but a rare moment of unscripted humanity on a stage usually reserved for carefully crafted entertainment. In that brief pause between on-air segments, something had fundamentally shifted. What had begun as a standard promotional appearance had transformed into something neither the producers nor the audience had anticipated, a genuine conversation about things that matter beyond the ephemeral world of entertainment. And as the commercial break timer counted down, everyone in the studio, from the newest production assistant to the most jaded crew member, seemed to share a collective understanding. They weren't just making television anymore. They were witnessing something real. Behind his camera, Mark Chen adjusted his focus, preparing for the segment's continuation. In 15 years of filming celebrities, he developed an instinct for meaningful moments, the rare instances when public personas gave way to authentic human connection. What was unfolding before him belonged in that category. The floor director's fingers silently counted down. 2. The monitor flashed commercial and the studio lights dimmed slightly, but the energy in Studio 6B remained charged with expectation, the sense that they were witnessing not just another celebrity interview, but a rare moment of unscripted humanity on a stage usually reserved for carefully crafted entertainment. The moment the on-air light darkened, the studio erupted into controlled chaos. Makeup artists rushed forward to touch up both men. Sound technicians adjusted microphone levels and production assistants darted between camera positions with updated instruction cards. But beneath the technical adjustments lay a current of uncertainty, a recognition that the show had ventured into uncharted territory. Jimmy stood up, stretching his legs while staying close enough to Chuck for a private conversation. His usual between-segment banter with the audience was noticeably absent. "I didn't mean to put you on the spot about the faith thing," he said to Chuck, his voice low enough that only those closest could hear. Chuck waved away the concern. You didn't. If I wasn't willing to discuss it, I wouldn't have brought it up. Gavin approached, tablet in hand, anxiety evident in his quick movements. Jimmy, we're trending on Twitter already. Number Chuck Jesus is picking up steam. Good trend or bad trend? Jimmy asked, accepting a bottle of water from an assistant. Mixed, very mixed. Gavin scrolled through the feed. Some are saying it's refreshing to see authentic conversation. Others are complaining that it's getting too preachy. Jimmy took a long drink, buying time to think. The commercial break would last only 3 minutes, not enough time to fully recalibrate a show that had suddenly veered off its planned course. His mind raced with competing priorities, entertainment value, ratings, considerations, his own reputation, and the unexpected weight of the conversation they'd been having. The network executives are watching the live feed, Gavin continued, lowering his voice further. Marissa just texted me. They're concerned about the religious content. Jimmy glanced at Chuck, who stood a few feet away, completely at ease. Despite the swirling tension around him, the martial arts legend wasn't checking his phone or consulting with his team. He simply waited, present in a way few celebrities managed in the high-pressure environment of television. What do you want to do? Gavin pressed. We've got the physical comedy segment with the dummy all set up. We can still pivot back. No, Jimmy decided abruptly. Let's stay with this. It feels I don't know important somehow. Gavin's eyes widened slightly. The network. We'll deal with it, Jimmy finished. Sometimes you have to follow the moment. Right. He glanced at Chuck, who sat calmly in his chair, seemingly untouched by the frantic energy swirling around him. Gavin hesitated. 20 years of television production experience, wearing with what he was witnessing. Something authentic emerging in the least authentic of environments. Okay, he finally conceded, but I'll need to let them know upstairs. And you should prepare for some pushback tomorrow. Jimmy nodded, surprisingly unbothered by the prospect. Worth it. As Gavin retreated, tapping urgently on his tablet, Jimmy returned to his desk chair. Samantha, his longtime makeup artist, approached with powder and brush. You good? She asked quietly as she touched up his forehead. Yeah, better than good, actually. He met her eyes briefly. Ever have one of those moments when you realize maybe you've been doing something wrong for a long time? Samantha's hands paused fractionally. In 7 years of working with Jimmy, she'd never heard him express such vulnerability, especially not minutes before returning to air. We've all been there, she said simply, finishing her touch-up with professional efficiency. Across the stage, Chuck sat patiently as his own makeup artist made minor adjustments. His calm presence seemed to create a small island of tranquility amid the backstage frenzy. Several crew members found their eyes drawn to him, not with the typical celebrity fascination, but with a different kind of curiosity. What allowed someone to remain so centered when everyone around them was in perpetual motion? Mark Chen adjusted his camera settings while keeping one eye on the unfolding dynamics. In 15 years of filming celebrities, he developed an instinct for authentic moments. What he was witnessing was rare, a genuine collision of entertainment culture with something deeper, something that couldn't be scripted or manufactured. His director's voice crackled through his headset. Mark, when we come back, I want you tight on Chuck's face. Whatever's happening here, he's the center of it. Mark nodded, already making the adjustment. On his monitor, Chuck's face appeared in sharp focus, the weathered lines speaking of decades of experience, the clear blue eyes reflecting a quiet certainty. This wasn't the face of a man uncomfortable with unscripted moments. It was the face of someone perfectly at home in the present reality. Whatever it might bring nearby, Questlove and the band members conferred quietly, sensing that the usual upbeat musical interludes might not match the tone that had developed. The band leader made a quick decision, instructing his musicians to prepare something more subdued for the return from commercial. A subtle shift, but one that acknowledged the changed atmosphere in Studio 6B. In the front row of the audience, Elaine Winters leaned toward her husband, Robert. Something's happening here, she whispered. This isn't just an interview anymore. Robert, a retired pastor himself, nodded. He's standing firm without being confrontational. That's rare these days, especially on television. It reminds me of when you used to say that true conviction doesn't need to raise its voice, Elaine said, squeezing her husband's hand. 3 rows back, Tyler Jenkins, the young man in the Walker Texas Ranger shirt, was frantically texting his friends. You won't believe what's happening at Fallon right now. Chuck Norris is talking about Jesus, and it's not a joke. Fallon doesn't know what to do. His phone lit up with immediate responses. No way. Clip is Fallon making fun of him. Chuck should roundhouse kick him law. Tyler typed quickly. No, that's the thing. It's actually serious. And Fallon's listening. Like really listening? It's wild. Around Tyler, other audience members were similarly engaged, some recording discreetly on their phones despite the no recording policy, others discussing in hushed tones what they were witnessing. The collective energy had shifted from the expectation of entertainment to something more contemplative, more engaged. Near the back of the audience section, network executive Marissa Chen slipped into an empty seat, having rushed down from the executive offices upstairs. Her expression was tense as she observed the stage, mentally calculating potential ratings implications, social media reactions, and advertiser concerns. Meanwhile, in the shadowed area just off stage, Chuck's manager, Gerald Henshaw, watched with a mixture of professional concern and personal fascination. In 23 years of representing Chuck Norris, he'd guided his client through countless interviews, carefully managing his public image and brand. Tonight was different. Chuck had gone off script in a way that made Gerald both nervous and oddly proud. A production assistant sidled up to him. "Is Mr. Norris okay with continuing this religious discussion?" she asked tentatively. Gerald couldn't help but smile. Chuck's been himself for longer than most people in this building have been alive. He'll be fine. The floor director began the countdown. Back in 30 seconds. Across the stage, Jimmy returned to his seat, running a hand through his hair, a rare break in his usually impeccable appearance. "Sorry if this isn't going the way you expected," he said to Chuck. Chuck's response was a simple smile. "Life rarely does, Jimmy. That's where faith comes in handy." Something in the martial artist's calm centeredness seemed to ground Jimmy. His shoulders relaxed visibly. And for perhaps the first time in years of hosting, he felt no need to mentally rehearse his next quip or prepare his next reaction. He was simply present, ready to continue a genuine conversation rather than perform an interview. 10 seconds, called the floor director. Jimmy squared himself in his chair, but not with his usual performative energy. Instead, he seemed to be making a conscious choice to meet the moment with greater authenticity than his typical hosting persona allowed. 5, 4. The silent countdown continued on fingers. The applause sign lit up. The audience responded and the cameras rolled. But everyone in Studio 6B, from the newest production assistant to the most veteran crew member, sensed that what was about to unfold would not follow any predetermined script. In the sound booth, audio engineer Raj Patel adjusted his levels, noticing something unusual where normally he'd be constantly adjusting for Jimmy's animated vocal range, from quiet aids to exuberant exclamations. Now the host's voice had settled into a more natural cadence. It was as if the performative layer had been peeled away, revealing something more genuine beneath. The commercial break ended, but the usual energetic return to programming was replaced by something more measured. Jimmy's typical bounce was subdued, his trademark wide grin replaced by a more thoughtful smile. "Welcome back to The Tonight Show. We're here with Chuck Norris, and we're having a conversation that honestly I didn't expect to have tonight." He turned to Chuck with newfound sincerity. Before the break, you were talking about finding strength in faith rather than just physical power. I think a lot of people might be surprised by that, especially from someone known for, well, kicking bad guys through walls. There was gentle laughter from the audience, but it wasn't the usual raucous response. Like Jimmy, they seemed to have collectively shifted into a different mode of engagement. "Hollywood creates personas," Chuck replied, "and sometimes we start to believe them ourselves. For many years, I was caught up in being Chuck Norris, the invincible fighter who never loses. But that's not reality. Nobody's invincible." In the quietness of the studio, his words carried a weight beyond their simple meaning. The usual background hum of shuffling and whispers had faded, leaving an almost sacred stillness. "I've lost plenty," Chuck continued. "Failed marriages, business ventures, friendships. Being strong didn't protect me from any of that. But faith gave me a framework to find meaning in failure, to grow through it instead of just being destroyed by it." As he spoke, Chuck recalled a particularly dark period after his first marriage collapsed. He'd been at the height of his film career, wealthy, famous, physically powerful, yet utterly unable to fix what mattered most. It was during that time that Pastor John had first entered his life, not with easy answers or religious platitudes, but with a simple invitation. What if strength looks different than you've been taught? That question had begun a journey that transformed Chuck's understanding of power, success, and purpose. A journey that continued to this day, decades later. Mark Chen captured a close-up of Jimmy's face as he listened. The entertainers practiced expressions, giving way to genuine contemplation. In the monitor, Mark could see the moment happening in real time. A man known for creating moments, watching as an authentic one unfolded before him, beyond his control, yet somehow more valuable because of it. In the control room, the director whispered, "Stay with this. Don't cut away." The camera held steady on both men, Chuck speaking with quiet conviction, Jimmy listening with unexpected receptiveness. The usual rapid cutting between shots designed to maintain energy and momentum had been replaced by a more deliberate approach, allowing the conversation to breathe and develop at its own pace. "You know," Jimmy said after a moment, "I've interviewed hundreds of celebrities, and most of them talk about their accomplishments. Awards they've won, records they've broken. You're talking about your failures like they're just as important as your successes." "More important," Chuck corrected gently. "I learned more from one divorce than from winning 6 world championships." The stark honesty of the statement silenced even the restless coughers in the back rows. This wasn't the carefully curated vulnerability of typical celebrity interviews, the kind designed to seem authentic while revealing nothing truly costly. This was something else entirely. In his mind, Chuck was remembering another conversation with Pastor John, this one just weeks before the older man passed away. They had sat together in the hospital garden, his frail body wrapped in a blanket despite the Texas heat. "The world will remember your kicks and punches, Chuck," the pastor had said, "but God is forming something far more powerful in you now, the courage to be honest about your weaknesses." That memory gave Chuck a serenity that was palpable. Even through the television cameras, he wasn't performing. He was simply present, speaking truth as he understood it without needing everyone to agree. In the executive row, Marissa Chen shifted uncomfortably, still calculating potential fallout. Yet even she couldn't deny the compelling nature of what was unfolding. Her years in network television had taught her to recognize ratings gold, even when it came in unexpected packaging. Whatever was happening here, people would talk about it tomorrow. Behind his camera, Mark Chen felt a strange sense of privilege, not just to be documenting a celebrity interview, but to be witnessing something authentic, breaking through the carefully constructed artifice of television. In 15 years behind the lens, such moments were vanishingly rare. Jimmy seemed to recognize the rarity too. "We had this whole segment planned, jokes, physical comedy, the whole bit. But this conversation feels more important somehow." "Laughter has its place," Chuck acknowledged. "Jesus enjoyed celebrations and gatherings. Faith doesn't mean being somber all the time, but it does mean being honest," Jimmy suggested, venturing into the dialogue with surprising thoughtfulness. Chuck nodded, appreciation evident in his expression. "Exactly. Honest with yourself first, then with others. When I was younger, I thought being tough meant never showing vulnerability. Now I understand that real strength is being secure enough to be vulnerable." Mark Chen zoomed out slightly, capturing both men in profile. Two figures from different worlds finding unexpected common ground under the artificial sun of studio lights. In his viewfinder, Mark saw something beyond the usual celebrity interview. He was witnessing a genuine human connection forming in the least likely of places, and in that moment something shifted in Studio 6B. Not just for the two men on stage, but for everyone present. The audience, the crew, the band members all had come expecting entertainment, and found themselves instead in the presence of something authentic, something that spoke to deeper hungers than mere amusement could satisfy. As the segment approached another commercial break, the usual signals appeared. The floor director making the wrap-it-up motion, the countdown beginning on fingers. But for perhaps the first time in the show's history, these technical necessities seemed like intrusions into something more valuable than the television format itself. Jimmy acknowledged the signals with a reluctant nod, then turned back to Chuck. "We have to take another break, but when we come back, I'd love to hear more about how you integrate this faith into your daily life, the practical side of it." Chuck nodded, recognizing and appreciating Jimmy's genuine interest. "We'll be right back with more Chuck Norris," Jimmy said to the camera. But the usual performative enthusiasm was replaced by something more thoughtful, more measured as the applause sign lit up, and the studio audience responded. The sound seemed different too. Not the automatic reaction to a cue, but an appreciation for something unexpected and valuable they had just witnessed. The on-air light darkened. The studio hummed with energy. but it wasn't the usual frantic between-segment activity. Something had changed. Something intangible yet undeniable. Mark Chen lowered his camera slightly, rolling his shoulders to release the tension that had built as he focused with unusual intensity. On his monitor, he could still see Chuck and Jimmy, no longer performer and host, but two men engaged in conversation about things that mattered beyond the ephemeral world of entertainment. And as the commercial break timer counted down, everyone in Studio 6B seemed to share a collective understanding. They were no longer just making television. They were witnessing something real. The floor director's fingers counted down. 3, 2, 1. The on-air light blazed back to life and the audience applauded on cue. But there was a different quality to the studio atmosphere now. A collective leaning in, an expectancy that transcended mere entertainment. Jimmy settled back into his chair, noticeably more relaxed than his usual performative posture. The hyperkinetic energy that characterized his hosting style had given way to something more grounded, more present. His shoulders were looser, his smile more genuine, as if he'd shed a layer of professional armor during the commercial break. "We're back with Chuck Norris," he said, his voice carrying a warmth that seemed to emerge from genuine connection rather than professional charm. "Chuck, before the break, we were talking about how your faith has shaped you beyond what most people see in your public persona." Chuck nodded appreciatively, recognizing the sincerity in Jimmy's approach. "Most people know me for fighting on screen, but the real battles are always internal, aren't they? Pride, fear, anger, these are the opponents we all face." In the audience, several people nodded in unconscious agreement. A woman in the second row dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. Next to her, a teenage boy who had come expecting comedy skits and viral moments sat forward, unexpectedly engaged by the authentic exchange unfolding before him. "I've spent my life teaching people how to defend themselves physically," Chuck continued. "But I've learned that emotional and spiritual self-defense are just as important. Faith gives me that framework." As he spoke, Chuck's mind drifted momentarily to his early days in Hollywood, the pressure to maintain the tough guy image, the temptations that came with fame, the gradual realization that external success couldn't fill the internal void. Pastor John had entered his life during that period not with judgment, but with a simple question. What if everything you're chasing isn't actually what you're looking for? That question had haunted him for months before he finally acknowledged its truth. Jimmy leaned forward, his curious expression unfeigned. "You know what I find interesting? You're talking about Jesus and faith, but you're not trying to convert anyone. There's no sales pitch." The observation was astute, a recognition of the difference between testimony and proselytizing, between sharing experience and demanding agreement. Chuck's smile was gentle but direct. "Faith isn't a product to sell. It's a relationship to share. When you truly value something, you don't need to force it on others. Its value speaks for itself." Mark Chen adjusted his frame to capture both men in profile, a composition that highlighted the unexpected connection forming between them. Through his viewfinder, he saw something rare in television, a genuine exchange rather than a performance. Years of filming celebrities had taught him the difference between manufactured moments and authentic ones. This belonged firmly in the latter category. In the control room, the director kept her instructions minimal, allowing the natural rhythm of the conversation to guide the production. "Stay with the two-shot," she murmured to her team. "Let's not break this flow." "I have to admit," Jimmy said, surprising himself with his candor, "when you mentioned Jesus earlier, my first instinct was to make it into a joke. It's what we do here. Keep things light. Keep things moving." He paused, searching for the right words. "But sometimes I wonder if we're too quick to make everything a punchline." The admission carried a vulnerability unusual for the polished entertainer. In the wings, Gavin watched with a mixture of professional concern and personal fascination. In 7 years as Jimmy's producer, he'd never heard the host speak so candidly on air, especially not about his own approach to the show. "Humor has its place," Chuck acknowledged, "but so does sincerity. The challenge is knowing which moment calls for which response." "And how do you know?" Jimmy asked, the question emerging with unexpected earnestness. Chuck considered this, his weathered face thoughtful beneath the studio lights. His eyes briefly drifted to the back of the audience where a young family sat watching parents with 2 preteen children, their faces illuminated by the stage lights. In that moment, he was reminded why these conversations mattered. You listen not just to the words being said, but to what lies beneath them. Sometimes people use humor to test whether it's safe to be serious. The insight landed with visible impact. Jimmy's expression shifted as if something had clicked into place. A recognition of patterns in his own interactions. Perhaps in the front row, Elaine Winters whispered to her husband, "He's reaching him." Robert nodded, squeezing her hand. That's how truth works, not with force, but with recognition. Mark Chen zoomed in slightly on Jimmy's face, capturing the subtle transformation taking place. The camera registered what the audience could sense beneath the well-crafted persona of the entertainer. Something more authentic was emerging. "You know," Jimmy said after a moment, "we had this whole bit planned with a dummy and a roundhouse kick demonstration." He chuckled. But it wasn't his usual performative laugh. "Seems kinda silly now, doesn't it?" "Not silly," Chuck corrected gently. "Just different. There's a time for play and a time for depth. Both have value." Jimmy nodded, absorbing this. "I guess as a host I sometimes default to keeping things light because it feels safer. Nobody gets uncomfortable. Nobody changes the channel. Safety isn't always growth, though," Chuck observed. "Some of my most important moments came through discomfort. Having my assumptions challenged, my priorities questioned." Behind his camera, Mark Chen felt a strange resonance with the martial artist's words. His own journey from China to America had been filled with such moments discomfort that led to growth, challenges that forged resilience. He found himself nodding slightly as he maintained his focus. The professional boundary between observer and participant momentarily blurred. The conversation had transcended the typical celebrity interview format. It wasn't about promoting a project or sharing amusing anecdotes. It had become a genuine exploration of ideas, the kind rarely seen in late-night television. In the control room, the director made a decision. Stay with the two-shot. Let this breathe. The usual rapid cutting between camera angles slowed, allowing the natural rhythm of the conversation to dictate the visual flow. On screens across America, viewers were seeing something increasingly uncommon in the age of viral clips and sensationalized moments, an authentic exchange between two human beings. "I'm curious," Jimmy said, leaning forward slightly. "There must have been times in Hollywood when your faith made you the odd man out. How did you handle that?" Chuck nodded, acknowledging the reality behind the question. With varying degrees of success, he admitted with a small smile. "Early on, I worried too much about fitting in, about being accepted. I kept certain parts of myself hidden. And now I understand that authenticity attracts the right people and opportunities. Yes, some doors closed because of my faith, but others opened that I never would have discovered otherwise." In his mind, Chuck recalled another conversation with Pastor John, this one from the early days of their friendship. When Chuck was struggling with the disconnect between Hollywood's values and his emerging faith. "You don't have to choose between being successful and being faithful," John had told him. "But you do have to choose which kind of success matters most to you." That guidance had shaped decades of career decisions, leading Chuck down a path different from many of his contemporaries, one that prioritized meaning over mere visibility. "There's something powerful about that kind of clarity," Jimmy observed, surprising himself with the depth of his engagement, knowing what matters to you, what lines you won't cross. It simplifies decision-making. Chuck agreed. Not always easy, but clearer. In the third row, Tyler Jenkins, the young man in the Walker Texas Ranger shirt, had stopped texting entirely. His phone lay forgotten in his lap as he listened with unexpected focus. He had come for nostalgia and entertainment. He was receiving something more substantial. The audience sat in rapt attention. Many phones lowered and forgotten. They had come expecting entertainment. They were receiving something closer to wisdom. Mark Chen maintained his focus, aware that he was documenting something significant. His camera captured the subtle interplay of expression between the two men. Jimmy's growing thoughtfulness, Chuck's steady presence, the emerging connection between them that transcended their different worlds. "We're coming up on the end of our time," Jimmy said, genuine regret in his voice. "But I have to say, this wasn't the conversation I expected to have tonight." "The best conversations rarely are," Chuck replied with a warm smile. "They're discovered, not planned." Jimmy nodded, a new understanding evident in his expression. "Before we wrap up, is there anything else you'd want people to know about your faith, your journey?" Chuck took a moment to consider, his calm presence filling the silence with significance rather than awkwardness. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the quiet authority of lived experience. I would say that strength isn't about dominating others or even overcoming circumstances. True strength is about remaining steadfast in what matters most, especially when it's difficult. He paused, then added, "And for me, what matters most is loving God and loving others not perfectly but sincerely." The simplicity and clarity of the statement resonated through Studio 6B. Not everyone would share Chuck's specific beliefs, but the authenticity behind them was undeniable. "Chuck Norris, everyone," Jimmy said, rising to shake Chuck's hand with genuine respect. "Thank you for an unexpected but really meaningful conversation." As the audience applauded, not the usual raucous response to a comedy bit, but something more appreciative, more thoughtful, Jimmy made an unscripted addition. "Sometimes the best television happens when we set aside the plan and just have a real conversation. I think that's what we experienced tonight." The camera pulled back, capturing both men standing together. No longer host and guest playing prescribed roles, but two human beings who had connected in an authentic way under the most artificial of circumstances. And as the segment concluded and the director called clear, something lingered in Studio 6B, a sense that they had all witnessed something beyond entertainment, something that spoke to deeper hungers than mere amusement could satisfy. The house lights brightened as the on-air sign darkened for the final time. The mechanical rhythm of television production resumed. Stagehands dismantling sets, audience handlers directing people to exits, production assistants already preparing for tomorrow's show. But beneath the practiced efficiency ran an undercurrent of something unusual, a lingering resonance that seemed to touch everyone in Studio 6B. Jimmy and Chuck remained seated a moment longer than protocol dictated, neither rushing to break the connection that had formed. The makeup artist hesitated before approaching, sensing something significant in the silent exchange between the two men. "That wasn't what I expected," Jimmy said finally, his voice stripped of its performative quality. Chuck nodded, a gentle understanding in his expression. The best conversations rarely are. As they rose from their chairs, Jimmy extended his hand again. This handshake wasn't the perfunctory greeting that had opened the show, but something more meaningful. An acknowledgement between two men who had found unexpected common ground beneath the glare of studio lights. They moved off stage together, surrounded by the flurry of post-broadcast activity yet somehow apart from it. Sound technicians carefully removed their microphones. Makeup artists dabbed away the shine from their faces, but the conversation between them continued in lowered voices. "You know, we had this whole segment planned," Jimmy said. "The roundhouse kick demonstration, the Chuck Norris facts, bit all of it carefully scripted for maximum entertainment value." "Sometimes the unplanned moments are the most valuable," Chuck replied. They reached the junction where their paths would naturally diverge, Jimmy to his office, Chuck to the green room, but neither seemed eager to end the exchange. "I've got to ask," Jimmy said, lowering his voice further. "When I made that joke about Jesus, you didn't get defensive or angry. You didn't even seem bothered. How do you do that?" Chuck considered the question, his weathered face thoughtful beneath the harsh backstage lighting. "I've learned that defensive responses rarely change minds. They just confirm what people already believe about faith, which is what? That it's fragile? That it can't withstand questioning or humor?" Jimmy nodded slowly, absorbing this. A production assistant approached, tablet in hand, urgency in her step. "Mr. Fallon, the network executives are asking for you." Jimmy acknowledged her with a quick nod, but his attention remained on Chuck. "Would you mind stopping by my office before you leave? I'd like to continue this conversation away from all the—" He gestured vaguely at the bustling backstage area. "I'd like that," Chuck agreed. As they parted temporarily, the backstage area continued its post-show rhythm. Yet something had shifted in the atmosphere. Crew members exchanged glances, sensing that something beyond the usual celebrity appearance had transpired. Something that had left its mark not just on the two men at its center, but on everyone who had witnessed it. In the green room, Chuck's manager, Gerald Henshaw, waited with barely contained anxiety. The television monitor still displayed the Tonight Show logo as the broadcast transitioned to local news, but Gerald had watched the entire segment with growing professional concern. "There you are," he said as Chuck entered. That was unexpected. Chuck accepted a bottle of water from an assistant, his expression serene. Yes, it was. Gerald's phone buzzed again, the 15th notification in as many minutes. "Social media is exploding. You're trending on 3 platforms." He scrolled rapidly through the notifications. "Reactions are mixed. Some saying it was refreshing to see authentic conversation, others complaining about religion on their comedy shows. Both fair points. Chuck observed mildly. Gerald studied his client with a mixture of professional concern and personal fascination. In 25 years of management, he had guided Chuck through countless interviews, carefully crafting his public image. Tonight had deviated from that carefully maintained course in ways that both alarmed and intrigued him. The network executives are huddled upstairs, Gerald continued, trying to decide if this helps or hurts ratings. Does it matter? Chuck asked, not dismissively but with genuine curiosity. Gerald looked up, momentarily startled by the question. In 30 years of entertainment management, ratings had always mattered. They were the currency of the industry, the measure of success or failure. But something in Chuck's question gave him pause. I suppose not, he admitted finally. Not to you. Anyway, a production assistant appeared at the door. Mr. Norris, Jimmy asked if you could stop by his office before you leave. Of course, Chuck replied. Gerald checked his watch instinctively. We've got the car waiting, and the red eye back to the car can wait, Chuck said simply, his tone making it clear that this wasn't a request, but a decision. Mark Chen packed his camera equipment with practice efficiency, but his movements lacked their usual precision. His mind kept returning to the footage he'd captured, not the planned physical comedy, but something he hadn't expected to document in a late-night studio. Genuine human connection. That was something else, wasn't it? His director approached, helping coil a stray cable. Mark nodded, securing his primary lens in its padded case. 15 years behind this camera, and that was one of the most real moments I've seen on this stage. I've already had 3 calls from upstairs, the director said, lowering her voice. They can't decide if it was brilliant television or format suicide. Why not both? Mark suggested with a small smile. The director laughed softly. That's exactly what I told them. Around them, the stage crew worked with quiet efficiency, dismantling the night's illusion with practiced hands. But there was a different quality to their movements tonight. A thoughtfulness, a presence that was typically absent in the mechanical routine of television production. Mark's phone vibrated in his pocket, the 10th notification in as many minutes. Colleagues, family members, even old classmates were messaging about the segment they just witnessed. One message from his mother simply read, "Just saw Chuck Norris on Fallon. Reminded me why faith matters. Call me tomorrow." Mark smiled, tucking the phone away. In a career spent capturing moments designed primarily to entertain and be forgotten, it was rare to document something that might actually linger in viewers' thoughts beyond their next social media scroll. In the audience section, most people had already filed out, guided by staff toward elevators and exits. But Elaine and Robert Winters remained seated, seemingly reluctant to break the spell of what they'd witnessed. That wasn't just good television, Elaine said softly. That was a moment of witness. Robert nodded, his pastor's heart recognizing the significance, the most effective kind. Not preaching, just authentically living truth in a way others can recognize. They watched as the last audience members made their way toward the exits. Many engaged in animated conversations. Near the stage, a young man in a vintage Walker Texas Ranger t-shirt stood looking thoughtfully at the now empty set. Quite something, wasn't it? Robert offered as they passed him. The young man, Tyler Jenkins, according to his visitor badge, turned with a startled expression. Yeah, I came for the nostalgia, you know. Thought it would be funny to see him do the kicks and stuff. He paused, searching for words. But this was different. Made me think. That's never a bad thing, Elaine said with a gentle smile. Tyler nodded, then glanced down at his phone where messages from friends continued to accumulate. Most were asking for clips, reactions, inside details. But how could he capture in text what he just witnessed? It wasn't about quotable lines or dramatic moments. It was about a feeling, a rare instance of authenticity breaking through the carefully constructed veneer of entertainment. Jimmy Fallon sat alone in his office, jacket discarded, tie loosened. On the wall hung framed photos of his celebrity encounters, visual testimony to his place in the entertainment ecosystem. But tonight, those images seemed less significant somehow, as if their currency had been subtly devalued by the authentic exchange he'd just experienced. A gentle knock at the door preceded Chuck's entrance. Jimmy rose, gesturing to a chair across from his desk. "Thanks for coming by," he said. "I wanted to say something away from the cameras, away from all the—" He gestured vaguely toward the studio beyond his office walls. Chuck nodded, taking the offered seat with the same unhurried calm that had characterized him throughout the evening. Jimmy settled back into his chair, uncharacteristically silent for a moment. When he finally spoke, his voice carried none of his public persona's careful modulation. I've done thousands of interviews, celebrities, politicians, athletes, musicians, and I always thought I was good at making genuine connections. But tonight made me realize how rarely I allow anything truly authentic to happen in that space. Chuck listened without interruption, his attention complete the same quality of presence that had altered the atmosphere of the show. Anyway, Jimmy continued, I just wanted to say thank you not just for being a good sport but for being real when I was, while being a host instead of a person. We all play roles, Chuck replied kindly. The question is whether we remember there's more to us than those roles. The simple observation resonated more deeply than elaborate philosophy might have. Jimmy nodded, a thoughtful expression replacing his usual animated features. Your pastor friend, the one you mentioned during the show? What was his name? Pastor John Callahan. He sounds like he was a wise man. Chuck smiled, memories warming his eyes. He was, and like most truly wise people, he communicated profound truths in simple ways. He paused, then added, one thing he often said was, the world doesn't need more performers. It needs more witnesses, people who speak truth not because it's popular but because it's true. Jimmy absorbed this, nodding slowly. I think he was right. They sat in companionable silence for a moment. Two men from different worlds connected by an unexpected moment of authenticity. Finally, Chuck rose. I should let you get home. I imagine hosting a daily show doesn't leave much time for rest. Jimmy stood as well, extending his hand. Thanks again, Chuck, for everything. They shook hands. Not the performative handshake of television, but the genuine connection of two human beings acknowledging each other beyond their public roles. The next morning, as New York awakened to its usual rhythms, something unusual was happening across social media and news sites. Clips from The Tonight Show were circulating widely, not the planned physical comedy, but moments from the unexpected conversation between Jimmy Fallon and Chuck Norris. The most shared clip captured Chuck's response to Jimmy's initial joke. Not his words, but his calm, centered presence that had transformed the studio atmosphere. Comments multiplied beneath it. Never seen anything like this on late-night TV. Actual conversation instead of promotional sound bites. The way he didn't get defensive but didn't back down either. Powerful. Jimmy's face when Chuck talked about finding strength and faith. Priceless. In corporate boardrooms, network executives gathered to analyze overnight ratings and engagement metrics. The data was mixed. Viewership had remained steady throughout, but engagement metrics showed unusual depth. People weren't just watching. They were watching, repeatedly sharing, discussing. In his hotel room, Chuck Norris sat with his morning coffee, reading messages from friends who had caught the broadcast. He wasn't checking trending topics or video metrics. Those measurements had long ceased to be his markers of meaning. Instead, he reflected on the unexpected opportunity that had emerged from what could have been just another promotional appearance. In the artificial environment of television, something authentic had found space to breathe. Not because it was forced, but because it was real. His phone rang. Gerald, undoubtedly with updates on the interview's reception. Before answering, Chuck took a moment to center himself in the understanding that had guided him for decades. True significance wasn't found in fleeting attention or viral moments, but in living consistently from conviction, allowing truth to speak through both words and silence. He answered the phone with a simple good morning, ready for whatever the day might bring, neither seeking controversy nor avoiding it, neither pursuing attention nor fearing it. Just present, authentic and at peace. And in that presence lay a testimony more powerful than any roundhouse kick he'd ever delivered on screen. The quiet strength of a man who had found something worth standing for and the grace to stand for it without needing everyone to stand with him. In offices and homes across America, the conversation continued about faith and authenticity, about performance and truth. Not everyone agreed with Chuck's specific beliefs, but many recognized and respected the authenticity behind them. And perhaps that was the most powerful legacy of the unexpected exchange, a reminder that beneath our carefully constructed personas lies the human hunger for something real, for conversations that matter, for connections that transcend entertainment, for truth that endures beyond trending topics. In a culture that often prioritized performance over authenticity, Chuck Norris and Jimmy Fallon had shared a moment of genuine human connection under the most artificial of circumstances. And in doing so, They had reminded viewers of a simple truth. Sometimes the most powerful statement isn't made through clever words or dramatic gestures, but through the quiet strength of remaining steadfast in what matters most, especially when it isn't easy. That truth wouldn't trend forever. It wouldn't generate endless viral clips. But for those who recognized it, who felt its resonance in their own lives, it offered something more valuable than fleeting entertainment. It offered hope that authenticity still had power. That conviction could speak louder than performance. That sometimes the strongest response to mockery wasn't defensiveness or withdrawal, but simply standing firm in the truth that had transformed your life. And in a world increasingly hungry for something real amid the carefully curated and strategically performed, perhaps that was exactly the reminder people needed. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.